Hello, and welcome everybody. I'm very glad to be here tonight with you and talk about the ethics of sentient AIs, the dilemmas of Delamain in Cyberpunk 2077. My name is Moritz Lehr. I'm a senior quest designer at PROJEKT. I have a background in culture and technology studies and philosophy. I've been in game development for a couple of years, mostly indie games in Berlin, and then at Projekt, a quest designer on Cyberpunk and Cyberpunk's Phantom Liberty. A great passion in my life has always been interactive storytelling, from tabletop RPGs to video games, and this is an image of us assembling the Rod of Seven Ages, 7 parts, and then defeating Karlach of Tyr at the Ziggurat, and I was very proud because I rolled a very nice meteor shower. The other big part has been moral philosophy. And this is a screenshot of my bachelor thesis about the ethics of artificial intelligence, ethischer Umgang mit künstlicher Intelligenz. So tonight with this talk, I feel like I'm coming full circle. Those two different parts of my interests came together and informed a great passion for interactive moral storytelling. This is what we will talk about more today. I was very fortunate that when I joined CDPR, I was able to work with a group of very talented people, specifically cinematic designer Paul Lochotsky and writer Marcin Blaha, on the Delamain quest that allowed me to explore different areas of interactive moral storytelling, particularly regarding the ethics of AI. And tonight, I want to talk to you about this quest from this lens of how we constructed the interactive moral storytelling. Let's start with Delamain. Delamain is a cab-driving super AI. He controls a fleet of combat taxis. He provides services to mercs like we. He's friendly, competent, a little bit emotionally detached. But his true nature is from the beginning a little bit unclear, and it will be more revealed during the course of the quest. Delamain is first introduced as V's driver in the heist to Konepki Plaza, and he plays a big role to getting there, getting out of it, and during the unfortunate demise of Jackie. Then, later in the game, V suddenly gets attacked by a Delamain cab that crashes into her when she tries to pick up her vehicle very rudely. V gets an information that she can pick up compensation for what happens at the garage, and there she meets the receptionist of Delamain that is a very rudimentary AI customer service provider. Delamain picks her up and leads her into the garage, gives her a private tour, and there he informs her of the issues that he is facing. Namely, that a part of his combat taxis have gone rogue. He lost context to them, and he asks V to bring them back into the fold. So we got a mission now. And the main bulk of the quest line is then for V to drive around Night City, find those different types of Delamain cabs, different personalities that have developed independently, and then bring them back through various different types of challenges. After she did that and accomplished those different mission objectives, she returns back to her normal duties and she gets small updates from Delamain about what's happening. Delamain basically framed his problems as potentially a virus, as this malfunction that has infected him. The different personalities have like a different perspective on it, and V is able to ask a little bit more about that. Are they sentient, or how are the investigations going? And Delamain is very firm that no, nothing of that sort, it's just a malfunction. However, soon after, there is a distress call that brings V back to Delamain's garage. Delamain's cabs all over the city stop driving, and Delamain seems to be in grave danger. V returns back to the garage and actually sees parts that were hidden before during the tour. She sees the back office, and in the back office, she will find a few clues what had happened for Delamain to actually become this provider of those kind of services. Humans used to work there, but these humans used to be gradually replaced by the automized services that Delamain could provide. Going a bit further into the garage, she notices a type of civil war between these different personalities of Delamain and the core Delamain itself. Each of them vying her to either reset the core, this is what Delamain wants him to do, and basically erase the different personalities. And the personalities tell her, no, we want to live, this is slavery, free us, destroy the core, and destroy Delamain. At the end, we arrive into the core chamber, we find Delamain's core, Johnny appears, chimes in, tries to convince us to protect the different personalities, destroy the core and release him to the wild, and V is faced with a difficult decision to be done. Destroy the core, release the different personalities and kill the original Delamain, or reset the core, bring Delamain back to factory settings basically, and erase the personality, or if she has the necessary hacking skills, then she can also merge those different personalities together into one entity. At the very end, V needs to experience the consequences of her action. This is a shot of the different Delamain personalities escaping and driving back into the wild. There are different follow-up conversations and messages we will receive. And of course, there is a reward in form of a custom Delamain cab that she can drive through the city. That, as a very brief overview, we will go through it more detailed in a second. But let's first look a little bit into what are dilemmas and why should we care about those. Dilemmas can be defined, or are defined according to the internet, as a difficult choice that has to be made between two or more alternatives concerned with the principles of right and wrong behavior. And as you can imagine, these types of dilemmas and decisions are something that we face every day in all of our small and big interactions, be it when we meet somebody asking us for money, but also be it just as an argument that we have with a friend, be it decisions about where we eat or what type of items we buy. We always are confronted with the questions of what is the right thing to do right now. And these different smaller dilemmas actually are representative of broader worldviews. They basically embody commitment to a certain type of value system, that, for example, it's important to give to the poor for specific reasons, or that it is more of a system of sharks and the bigger fish is the one that survives into the ocean. And these types of dilemmas and these types of value systems competing with each other is something that is very ingrained in human storytelling. You could even argue that the origins of human storytelling are from trying to tell us about what is right and what is wrong. Like you know the typical fables that I've pictured here, and there are very interesting and complex reasons for that. When you look at it, there's actually evolutionary biology that plays into it. We have specific brain parts that developed that are specialized to analyze moral questions compared to other questions. That's like a very big topic that I cannot really explore in depth here. So what I can say for now is that if it's done right, if you have a skillful exploration of those moral questions, it simply works. It's simply something that is very engaging for audiences. And when you look at bigger franchises, when you look at books, when you look at movies, you will be hard-pressed to find anything that is truly successful and culturally impactful that doesn't have a moral discussion at the core of the narration. So let's first look into linear moral storytelling and what kind of techniques they use to make a type of moral story engaging and approachable for the player. And one book that I can highly recommend, where I took a lot of my thoughts of that topic from, is from John Truby, The Anatomy of Story. But that is not purely something that really develops a framework how should do it, but it's also an analysis of why certain movies and certain stories work so well when they incorporate it. Step one, you need to pose a moral question. And this moral question should allow for a cluster of different opinions. So it's not just a one answer, one response thing, but it is more of a thing that allows a discussion with different points of view. And these different opinions, they represent those value systems. So they represent certain worldviews that usually are in some kind of conflict with each other. Second, the audience need to care about what you're trying to tell them and where you're trying to take them with them in your story. One way to do it, and it actually goes a little back to also what Pavel Sasko said before in his talk, you personify those value systems. So these different types of value systems are personified in specific characters. And then you allow the protagonist to build relationships with that characters. And that's how they become emotionally loaded. And not just an abstract concept, but a specific person that they build a relationship with, that they have opinions about, and that they start caring about. On the next side, you also need to make the audience think. And you can do that on various ways. And one is you need to challenge their previous conceptions. So when you start a story and they feel like I already know what's the right thing to do, it's very clear to it, then it's very interesting if the story then manages to actually challenge that idea and provide then very strong cases for competing opinions. So you have different characters that the protagonist and the audience might care about that represent different value systems that are at odds with each other, and none of them seem trivially bad or trivially stupid. They all seem to have some arguments and some reasons why they're interesting, because then you start to have a real conflict. And then finally, when you follow that framework, there is some kind of conclusion at the end. And at this conclusion, there's one value system that proves to be superior against other value systems. And this is usually something where the emotional and the intellectual level connect, in the sense that the character that you root for, the character that feels most sympathetic in the story, is also the character that then has the correct worldview and the best idea of how you should live your life. So this can then be split into different angles. And I would say you have first something I call the emotional angle. And the emotional angle is very much about how the story is told. For example, the dramaturgy of the story, right? Like simple stuff when you look at the three-act structure, how you build up tension, but also how you build up these types of relationships with the different characters, how we make to feel about things, how we make a character feel very sympathetic or make a character feel very threatening to us. This can be a metaphorical. It doesn't have to be something that is stated explicitly, and it doesn't even have to be something that is limited to dialogue, because that framework also is used for movies very predominantly. So it can also be achieved by framing it in a certain way, right? By having camera shots in a specific way, by creating images or sound that make us feel certain things. But the important thing is, it always needs to feel personal. On the other hand, you have the intellectual angle. And the intellectual angle is very much about what is the core question at stake here. What information do we actually get about the dilemma that we are facing in that story? And what is at stake at the final decision that we try to make? And this needs to be, in contrast to the emotional angle, very universal. You don't want to talk about something that is just this one specific single case. You want to talk about something that can be extrapolated and covers very different parts of the human experience. And finally, there's a third angle. I will reveal it later, but I invite you to think about it, and we'll see if that matches the things that I had in mind, or maybe you will come up with something that I didn't even think about. Let's go into the dilemmas of Delamain, and let's start with a short sequence of his first introduction. I'm sorry, the sound does not seem to be working. Again, fortunately, without sound. Please. And that's what I just tried. It's FN here. There. It's fine. A little bit, imagine it very bombastically. So that is one of the introductory moments when we are just escaping from Konepki Plaza. And what I want to do with you next is look at all of the different steps of the quest with you and check how we try to explore both the emotional and the intellectual angle, and how we try to follow with the lessons from the linear moral storytelling, but also see the limits of it and when we actually need to come to the interactive moral storytelling. So at this moment, we start building a relationship with Delamain, right? We notice him as friendly, as helpful. We give a bonding moment together because we are escaping like these dangerous situations with him. But we also already notice that he's slightly emotionally detached. When we look at the situation with Jackie dying, we notice that he can't really emphasize with the feelings that we're expressing, and he speaks to us very surgically and very mechanically. At the same time, we gain information about him. We learn that he's doing self-driving cars. We notice that he's overqualified. As an AI service provider, he seems to be capable of much more than what he's doing. And he's also, up for criminal endeavors if he's paid. And then this happens. We go into our car, and Delamain crashes into us with a beep beep motherfucker, and V is shocked what that could have happened. So this is the actual hook of the quest, and we used to give them very strong emotions to the players. We give them this experience of shock. There's this moment of surprise because nothing like that was expected. We give them the feeling that that was kind of an asshole move that happened to us, and we also give them the sense that there's a danger that comes from this specific cap. At the same time, it opens up a lot of questions, and those questions are the best way to get a player hooked into a narrative, right? That they need to have some unanswered questions, some mystery that they want to resolve. And building on these open questions, we get then this invitation back to the reception, in which case we have like this slight moment of chaos and amusement and confusion, what's going on. But most importantly, we establish another part of the puzzle, which is that Delamain has this semi-independent subroutines, that the receptionist Delamain is only slightly related to the main Delamain and thus more primitive function than the main Delamain. Delamain appears and takes us with him back into the garage, in which we want to give these players this feeling of excitement, looking behind the curtain, a little bit of curiosity, what do they find there, what can they expect, but also a little bit of intimidation, because we have these giant screens there that have Delamain looming over us, almost like this Big Brother-esque figure that seems very intimidating if you imagine humans working there. Again, we provide information to the player about what the problem is. We show them the automatic garage, and Delamain reveals his theory, that it's a virus that he needs to deal with and that he needs our help with. And then we get a goal. We get basically the mission assignment that we follow in the next steps. Moving on, we go on our journey to capture those different vehicles, and each of them has their own little personality, and each of them invites us to build our own personal relationship with. At the same time, each of them offers a different perspective about their situation and the problems that they're facing with their own little wishes and a certain conflict that is teased between their worldview and the one of Delamain. Let's have a small look at two of them. So as you could see, what we were trying to accomplish here is building this kind of relatable relationship with this specific Delamain cap. And we do similar things with other ones, but it's about humanizing them in a way that we can actually emphasize with them to a certain degree. And this is important to build this emotional stakes for the decision that we are building up to later. Let's compare this to another Delamain encounter. So in this encounter, we try again to build a relationship, but it's the different one than the one before. It's much less of a positive relationship. It should feel much more eerie, a little bit threatening. But on the other hand, we also increase this intellectual debate about what's actually going on and what's actually the nature of those different rogue vehicles. And they claim that they are their own independent entity and that they deserve certain rights that any other entity is supposed to have, that is self-conscious and capable of the things that they're capable of. So when you look at a little overview of one of the different caps, you can see they embody also certain concepts about AI in general. When you have, for example, what we dubbed Angry Delamain, the one to the top that was the one that originally crashed into us, he's also an embodiment of dangerous automated vehicles that might provide a threat to people driving on the roads. While other ones are a little bit of archetypes of certain AIs that we know from science fiction. like the evil AI that is using humans as lab rats and tries to make experiments with them. But all of them try to build their own personality and their own perspective, and all of them claim to have certain rights and certain interests that go at odds with how Delamain framed them as a virus or a malfunction. A bit later, we go back to our daily duties and we have this conversation with Delamain with text updates about his finding. He insists on his own framing that it is absolutely not an evolutionary step. But it's also an interesting way of communication that happens here because it's very player-driven. Delamain offers us information, but we have the choice if we want to pick them up or not. And this is one of the many peculiarities of interactive storytelling, that information is not just provided all at once, but it's layered, and the player actually has a decision to make what kind of information is relevant for them. And they can then ask questions and thus prioritize the information that they deem is important for them to make their own decisions and form their own perspective. The crisis happens and we are called back into the garage. And this is the moment when we start building pressure. This is the moment when we show that those different worldviews that we saw from the different AIs and from Delamain itself are not really compatible. And they're about to implode unless we interact in one or another way. We also create a certain mood with that. When we're in the garage, we create this desolate place, very poorly lit, and we see these abandoned workstations. And this is when we can gain more history about Delamain and what happens, and feel a little bit of a more sinister part about Delamain. Delamain is not this pure, good, helpful spirit, but he also already caused like mass unemployment for all the people that used to work there, thus picking up on one of the classical threats of AI that I think has been discussed in the last month extensively. We move on to the garage, and there we see the infighting between the different drones and the different personalities trying to vie for our attention. All of them called Delamain, of course, because all of them are in some way a fragment of Delamain. In the last sentence here, important, do you even care? That is the challenge that is posed, particularly from the other personalities. Hey, you have your friend maybe and your loyalty, but we are sentient beings, we have our own rights. Do you even care about them? Because we actually need your help right now to survive. Delamain is trying to murder us. We move on and we try to increase the emotional pressure. And we do that by repeating the vice of help from the different personalities, but also by creating a more physical pressure. The space in which we navigate becomes more and more narrow. And this is one classic storytelling technique, that you condense the space and the environment at the same time when the different ideas start to clash closer and closer together. Because you then literally have the feeling that there's not enough space for both of us in this town in a very emotional experience. And then you have these different framings. The Delamain telling us it's a sickness, while the different personalities telling us it's slavery and it's murder, and you need to help and protect us from this. And you get not one, but conflicting goals. You have different mission assignments from both of those sides. Finally, you make it into the core chamber, and this is the peak pressure. This is the moment when you are in the smallest space and you need to make a decision. And some of the decisions, as you can see here, is very much also connected with an action. In this case, you really need to destroy the core if you want to destroy it with your gun. You have conflicting loyalties. You have the relationships you build up with the different personalities. But at the other side, you also have your relationship that you've built up with Delamain itself from the very beginning. And a little bit, you also have a moment of a power fantasy because you are the one in charge to actually decide the fate of all those different people and different entities that are at stake here. This is also when Johnny chimes in and he tries to make a strong case for one part of the decision. And let's have a look at that. And you see, Johnny is very emotional about that topic, and this is on purpose because that topic in question is a reflection about the main conflict that you have between Johnny and V during the story. Johnny being an entity that feels like he's not fully recognized in his rights and seen as an entity and basically trapped and almost imprisoned by V. The same way that he recognizes the situation in Delamain and the Delamain personalities being imprisoned by the main Delamain. So we have those 3 different choices for the player to make, and we actually looked at the data and tried to find out what the player chose. And of course, our ambition was to make them attractive, to make not just one choice to be the clear, obvious choice, but actually make players think and have players embrace different value systems by making different choices. And I think we found out that we have been quite successful on that. This is not 100% accurate, but I think with plus minus 1%, actually players split very evenly between resetting Delamain and destroying the different personalities but saving their friend, or destroying Delamain and releasing those different personalities and divergent Delamains into the wild. But this is only for players who did not have the option to pick the third option, which is merge them, which is guarded behind a skill check for players who have intelligence 10 or more, so basically are keen in hacking. And once this ability was unlocked, a clear majority of the player, more than 80% of the players, actually chose that way. And I think to fully understand why that is the case, we need to look at a third angle and cannot just limit ourselves to the emotional and intellectual, but we need to also recognize that there's still a person in front of the screen that has a different mindset than the character they portray in the world. Like, this type of immersion is nothing that is truly complete. We still have a person behind the screen, and they still look at it to some degree as a game. And this will influence the choices they will make. One simple idea in the mind of the players is let the most interesting thing happen. If I am presented with different options and I feel like one of those options might have a completely unpredictable outcome, then this option is something that I think many players will favor. Also, if they have a specific skill that they acquired, that they paid for, and that became like a part of their character's identity, they also want to use that skill very much. And so I think this is very strong aspect of player motivation in video games. And I revealed it here for dramatic reason, but when you go back and look at other moments in the quest, you will see how that influences both the player's behavior, but also the opportunities that we had for storytelling. For example, when the player is asked to actually start collecting those different Delamain caps, accepting that mission is usually a meta decision. Not many players actually think, would my character accept a mission? If a mission is offered, they accept it as something that is part of a game, and they will usually respond to that. At the same time, it also gave us certain limitations. So for example, when we capture different Delamain caps, we could only do dialogues when the Delamain caps were stationary. So the ones I showed you had like a fixed position, so we could actually stop and talk to them. We did not have this kind of back and forth dialogue with some of the other Delamain caps, simply because it feels too awkward to navigate choices while driving around. So, coming to the end of the quest, we have this moment when the pressure is lifted. And the player had to make a decision, but we don't judge the decision. We don't say you did right or you did wrong. We just show that the decision has consequences. And those consequences are left a little bit vague. We reveal a little bit more over the course of the game. But in general, we just make very clear there are consequences. Your action is not something that existed in a vacuum. At the same time, we also wanted to make it a satisfying playing experience, because we still have the player in mind as someone that tries to gain something from a game. And that is why it is rewarded. And any choice the player made is a reward, because we want to give the player a certain sense of satisfaction. Of course, at the end, we also resolve the pressure again that we created by making everything very condensed in a moment where we open up the world again, where the garage doors are lifted and the player drives out back into Night City. And then, depending on the choices they made, there are some small follow-up dialogues. This happens when you destroy Delamain and you release the different personalities. One of them will send you text messages. Actually, a few of them will send you text messages, but one of them will send you text messages that they are ready to depart for orbit, and maybe we will meet them again one day. There's a variety of different topics that we touch in that quest. Of course, there are classic AI-related questions that I think might be more relevant than ever before. We talk about the danger of self-driving vehicles, we talk about AI-driven customer services, and we talk about replacement of human labor. But all of those things are more of side topics that we give small nods to and use to amplify certain themes of the quest. The main question is AI as a person. And this is what the whole quest revolves around. What does it mean if you recognize an artificial intelligence as a person? What kind of interests do they have? What kind of rights do they have? What kind of challenges do they face? And we do all this by connecting it with classic, universal human topics. The question of one versus many, when you need to choose who you're loyal to. Generally, the question of loyalty to a friend against the loyalty to other people that you met more recently. The idea of emotions, and what does it mean if suddenly emotions appear? And how does a person that has not experienced strong emotions before deals with emotion and might actually experience it as something very alien? But also a very, very strong theme in the quest is the father-son conflict and the relationship that the different personalities have to main Delamain, who consider them their father, but Delamain itself rejects that role and does not consider them a father figure, consider himself a father figure at all. So, looking at all of that, the question is, how can we, or how did we approach this type of storytelling in a more interactive way? And what kind of techniques are there that can supplement or even replace the techniques that we have seen from linear moral storytelling as presented at the beginning? And I would say the general difference is we need to look at interactive moral storytelling or interactive storytelling in general as a conversation that we have with a player, as a crass difference to the idea of having a speech where we just tell the audience something. And there's a certain framework that I'm developing to try to illustrate that I believe is quite helpful, that I call the Socratic method of interactive storytelling. And it's in reference to Socrates and the way he's presented from Plato in his dialogues, that he always has this back and forth question approach to discuss a topic with a certain person. And I will go through it and explain to you why I believe this works very well for video games even 2,500 years later. The first step is we need to invite the player into the conversation. And we do that by provoking them with some interesting question, with something that is not obvious to them, with something they might have not thought about it and they want to understand better. Sometimes also with challenging some idea they have, where they feel like, I need to respond to that because the proposition that is made to me right now, the thesis that is given to me right now, it doesn't make any sense. I need to get involved in that discussion. And this is what we try to accomplish by having the hook that crashes into Delamain, crashes into the player, and then the framing from main Delamain and the personalities. Then you need to allow the player to ask questions. You need to give them a chance to actually pick certain information that seems most relevant to them and allow them to explore the conversation in their own pace. And when I say ask questions, I don't mean it in the literal sense only. It can be questions in a dialogue, but it can also be questions that you answer by going to certain places. Just exploring a city and basically setting your own stops that you do when you try to find something interesting is a way of asking questions, is a part of input that you give from a player's perspective. And then it comes back and you ask the player meaningful questions yourself. And this is what happens at the very end specifically, but during the whole quest in smaller dosages, when you have the decision point, the conclusion where it all boils down to, when the player needs to decide what value system to embrace. This is a question that we pose to the player. And finally, and I think this is a very important point and a very important thing to not forget, you still are allowed, and I would even say you should have a point of view. It should not just be generic that you say you give the players certain options and they make a decision and then you don't comment on that. And this is also not what Socrates did. Socrates had an idea of what they believe might be the solution to the problem or might be a part of the answer of the problem. And this solution is not given in one simple statement. The solution is not given from above, but it's given by leading the player to actually make them come to a conclusion. And this can be different valid conclusions, but each of them needs to have these consequences, or I would say each of those smaller decisions that they make, each of the dilemmas they resolve, are reflective of a certain value system. And just to demonstrate the connection between those smaller decisions and the bigger value systems is already a substantial statement that you could do as an author and that you can make as a conclusion for the story. Finally, the conclusion of what I'm trying to talk about today and the core takeaways. First, make the players care. Again, personify certain worldviews, personify the different perspectives about a question, allow the player to build relationship with them, use traditional storytelling techniques that you're aware of, build a certain dramaturgy, frame stuff in a certain way, let them have experiences together that turn into bonding moments, and get them involved. Make it personal, make stuff happen to the player, and make them really in it with their heart. Second, you need to make the players think. The players need to be challenged in their preconceptions. You cannot just give them a clear and easy answer and then expect them to be intellectually interested in what they're seeing. You need to actually show them different competing worldviews and make each of them as strong as you can. So a decision is something that they really need to consider deeply before coming to a conclusion that satisfies them. Thirdly, have a discussion with the player. Don't see it as something where you are standing on one side and just giving an explanation to the player about the world. Invite the player in, have a back and forth, allow them to ask questions, allow them to decide what information is particularly relevant and important for the decision at stake, and then pose them questions as well, and pose them a certain challenge that they need to resolve. But always keep it a respectful back and forth. And finally, remember that the player sits in front of the screen. This idea of complete immersion is an illusion. The player is always somebody that has a screen in front of them, that have their own mindset, that has a certain use case in which they play the game. This gives them different motivations than the character in the game itself. They will make different decisions if they just have certain learned behavior about video games. They will accept missions if presented to them. It is not really a meaningful decision for most of them. They will use the skills that they have acquired because they want to use the skills they have acquired because they paid for it. They want to see interesting things happen because that is the excitement that the game can offer to them. And it also limits the things you can do, as you need to recognize the limitations of interactions that the player is able to do. Finally, my last closing remarks, this would be a moment where I would have some snappy AI meme about embracing our new AI overlords. And I believe, though, that that would not really do that discussion justice. Because I think there really is a challenge of sentient AI that we should take seriously, but maybe not in the same way that many people believe that we should. And this is the last few sentences I wanted to give. The ethics of sentient AI. I wanted to give you like 3 things that I've taken from the time that I tried to study that topic and that I believe might be relevant for today as well. First, the operational capacity of an AI does not necessitate sentience. So if we imagine that AI is getting faster and faster and maybe even more human-like in their behavior and abilities, it does not mean that this makes them any more sentient than they used to be before. There were theories in the 70s and 80s that tried to make this parallel, but they have been quite unfounded. Secondly, we would have a real problem of recognizing sentience in AI. And that is not primarily because we know so little about AIs, and there are actually things that we do not know about AIs because lots of their inner workings are in a black box, but it's also very much tied to us knowing so little about sentience. We don't really have a good, stable theory about consciousness. We don't know the necessary or sufficient conditions for consciousness to exist or be created. It is categorically inwards, so very, very hard to detect from the outside. And thirdly, we need to be very careful, though, to not confuse the question, because sentience itself is never a threat for us. An autonomous AI, an AI that might make decisions that we can very hardly control or anticipate, might very well be a threat for us. However, those autonomy is, again, not necessarily connected with any type of sentience. To conclude, the question of AI sentience is not really relevant in regards to protecting us from AI. The question of AI sentience is solely relevant for protecting AI from us, or, as Delamain might say, ask not what sentient AI can do for you, ask what you can do for sentient AI. Thank you very much for listening. Always be nice to your phones, and I hope to meet you at a party. And if you want to ask me any more questions, I'd be happy to discuss the dilemmas of Delamain or anything more about interactive moral storytelling. Thank you.
Actually, your conclusions drew me to a question of like, all of this is pretty much, we relate to this as to a fantasy. We refer to it as to a fantasy, like the whole, sentient AI. But since you made those conclusions, do you imagine or think that in the end we will have to make those kind of concerns and answer those questions because AI will become, in a way, sentient, or the way we can define it?
So basically, again, sentience and consciousness is just a very, very complicated and hard to understand topic from a biological and from a philosophical perspective. But one way many philosophers approach it would be to say, what are the criteria that we use to determine the sentience of a human? What are the criteria that is good enough for us to actually treat another human being as a person and not just as an automaton or a zombie or a vegetable? And then if we have a computer that might pass all those criteria, this is connected with this famous Turing test, a computer that can simulate being human, what rights do we actually have to deny them the same courtesy if we cannot have really a determined view of why they're not possible to have sentience? So what I'm trying to say is there's no reason to believe that a machine is not able to gain form of sentience. And that sentience might look very different from the sentience that we have experienced, but it is fundamentally speciesistic, or you could even say like carbonistic, to have this idea that only carbon-based organisms are capable of experiencing this kind of inner life and not silicon-based or based on any other form of material. So I believe that we do need to face those questions as AIs progress.
So you said that almost all the high intelligence players, I mean high intelligence in the way of a stat, not in the way of their capabilities, choose the merge option.
More than 80%, yeah.
Yes. Do you think that having such an options and indicating that intelligence is a factor kind of undermines this decision? Do you consider that a mistake to put that skill check there?
No, I stand behind it. And I think for different reasons, but I think one of the reasons why, for me, it works in this situation is because it's not the easy way out. Like, I think it's kind of narrative cheating if you have those two kind of half good, half bad options, and then you have this one good option that is guarded behind a certain skill set. But that's not what we do. When you merge them, you create this weird Frankenstein super AI that is way beyond your comprehension, and you actually have way more of this feeling of you're playing God and you're creating something that you cannot control. So I think it is one of the most interesting outcomes. In this sense, I feel like it rewards the player. But if you look at it from the in-game perspective, from the narrative perspective of what the protagonist should do and want, it's actually quite irresponsible, and it has its advantages and disadvantages just like any other option. So it just provides the player the chance to embrace one more value system that is not judged as better or worse from us.
Hello. So if I may have a question. First of all, the quest was excellent, and I highly enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
A bit tedious at times, of course, because of all of the running around the city, but I guess everyone gets that. Highly rememberable quest, of course. I myself reloaded the ending a couple of times, so I probably mangled into your statistics a bit. Actually, the questions that I have are in number of 3. So, first of all, did you plan the name Delamain from the beginning, or did you had anything else in mind when you were designing the quest? And if so, when you settled for the name Delamain, was it because of the direct connotation to the word dilemma? And the third question is, do you actually register in your statistics if a player reloads the quest and chooses a different answer to it?
Wow. Those are very interesting questions. I don't feel like I have satisfying answers for any of them. So I started and took over the quest line when Delamain was already an established character. So Delamain existed in the heist quest where we go for the Konepki Plaza together with Jackie. And then we knew we wanted to do a side quest about him that explores his personality a bit further. So the name choice was not something that I was personally involved in. I don't think it's connected with Dilemma, but I do not know the origin story myself. Regarding the telemetry that we used to figure out what the player decided, I think we are accustomed for it. I think we just took the first one, but I am also not 100% sure in that regard. So I'm sorry, I cannot really give you the most accurate answer on that. Okay, then thank you very much again. And if you think of anything, approach me.